Hello and welcome back. My name is Felicia and I'm currently on a mission to create an entire wardrobe's worth of Bridgerton inspired Regency costumes on a limited timeline. In the last video, we made this dressing gown, and if you'd like to see that tutorial, feel free to check out the previous one in this playlist or click the little button that should be somewhere up in that corner right now. In today's video, we're going to be creating a nightgown inspired by the one that Daphne wears in season 1 with this lovely jacquard. I'll be drafting the pattern for this nightgown myself using Seamly 2D, but I'm not going to go into too much depth on how I made the pattern because it's going to be based on the pattern that we made in the last video. So if you want to know all about how it was created, make sure you check out that one. With that said, let's get started. We're gonna kick this project off with some regret because apparently I was too lazy to grab my tripod and instead just put you at a really awkward angle. But essentially I started from a basic bodice block and marked out how thick I wanted the straps to be, extended the front bodice a little bit so that I'd have some room for pleating, marked out my underbust plus a little bit of extra ease just to make sure it ended up at the length that I wanted, and increased the neckline height ever so slightly so that it wouldn't be problematic. Then on the back I added that curve seam that you see in a lot of the Bridgerton costumes and drafted my skirts to fit each of those panels. Digital drafting can be a bit time consuming, but I did have excellent company throughout the process. Cutting out fabric is something that doesn't really need an explanation, so instead of taking the time to explain what I'm cutting here, I would like to take a moment to appreciate these adorable mugs that my mom made. One has happy little flowers and the other has a bumblebee in the middle, which is just so on point. To cut out the skirts for this Regency nightgown, I have to ask you a question. Assuming that lycanthropy is an X-linked recessive disorder due to the recessive allele W, hypothetically, when a woman with the W condition and a man without the condition mate, what percentage of their daughters will be afflicted with lycanthropy? I knew that eventually those 4 years, 2 bachelor's degrees, 1 master's, and a year of teaching would eventually become relevant again, though I didn't necessarily anticipate it in this context. If you're curious about the answer, 0% of the daughters would be afflicted, but 100% of the sons would have lycanthropy. Alright, so we have all of the pieces for the nightgown cut out, which is 2 of the front bodice on the fold, 4 of the back bodice not on the fold, this little button thing, backing thing, you know, the side back, which will fit there, and then front skirt, side skirt, back skirt. Okay, before we seriously? So before we officially start, oh my god, there's so many noises. Okay, so one thing that I had a thought on. So this is our front bodice panel. We added quite a bit of an extension here so there'd be extra fabric to pleat around the bust. And that, when we cut it out on the fold, leaves us with 2 of these very long bodices, which is good, that's what we wanted. But one thing I was thinking about is that it'd be much easier to pleat this and then add the trim in a really nice clean way if the lining was fitted to the correct size already. So I took one of those front panels and I pinned that extension bit out so that I can sew a quick seam there. It'll be in the lining, so the seam doesn't really matter. And that'll make this one fitted correctly and make the pleating so much easier. Quick order of operations. We're gonna start by sewing our back panels together by taking center back and matching it with side back on that curve seam. After that's sewn, we're going to match it to the front panel at the shoulder and the side seam. Then once we have 2 full layers with the back open so that we can have buttons, we will pin them right sides together and pleat all of this excess material on the front panel into place. Oh, and while we're pleating and matching them together, I'm also going to take this ruffle chiffon ribbon, cut it in half, and match it sandwiched between the inner and the outer layer all along that edge. Let's do this. This first. Okay, somewhat unsightly seam has been sewn, and I also added a couple of quick little darts just to make it actually fit slightly closer. Next step is the back. Pinning a curved edge can be a little bit tricky, so I like to start by pinning the very beginning and the end, then the dead center, and just kind of nudging the rest of the fabric into the right shape. Even if you have a few wrinkles along the way, usually they'll flatten out as you sew the rest of the curve. Unfortunately, it can be a little bit hands-on, which is why most of this footage is just the back of my hands. Very helpful, I'm sure. Now we attach shoulder and side seams. Because this line we have 4 shoulders and 4 side seams, left, right, and inside and outside to do. But they're just straight stitches and it's an empire waistline, so it only takes a second. After all those seams are sewn, I went ahead and serged all of my loose edges and ironed down all of the seams towards the back of the bodice. Okay, last thing that we need to do before we assemble the 2 layers of the bodice together is deal with the little button thing. I want to call it a planchet. I could look this up, but I don't want to. So we're going to fold it right sides together and then just sew on the top and bottom edge. On later review, I do believe I was combining a button placket and a Ouija board planchet, neither of which are correct. Now we match the inner and the outer layers, add the pleating, and add the trim. With all the other elements of this project going by really quickly, I was surprised by how long it took me to cut 3 yards of ribbon in half. It ended up being like a solid 30 minutes. And yet that was nothing compared to the 48 minutes spent sandwiching that ribbon between the 2 layers of the bodice and pleating the outer bodice in the process. In addition to sandwiching the ribbon though, I also added the button backing to one side of the back bodice and some elastic button loops to the other side. This ensured that there were only nice clean edges when I flipped it all right side out again. But it did require a bit of a brain break to recover from. Once everything was pinned, I sewed up the center back, around the back neckline, over the strap, across the front neckline, over the other strap, and ultimately down the center back. With the lining and the outer layer sewed together, I was able to flip it right side out, which left me to sort out the remaining raw edges on the inside of the armhole and the bottom of the bodice itself. For the armhole, I folded and pinned both layers in about 1/2 inch, all the way around the circle, making sure that everything was laying nice and flat throughout. I gave it a quick press, avoiding all of my pins, and then sewed all the way around each circle. With that, the armholes were complete. All right, with the bodice all sorted out, it's time to sew up this skirt. We have 1 front, 2 side backs, and 2 center backs. Both of the long edges on the center and the side panels are angled. And then on the back panel, we have 1 that's angled and 1 that's straight. So we have to make sure we match up exclusively the diagonal edges and we leave that 1 straight edge on each of the back pieces open, which we'll finish up later. I pinned up all of the raw edges and then went to the sewing machine to give them a quick straight stitch all the way across their length, and finally finished off the raw edges with my serger. At long last, it was time to attach the skirt to the bodice. I had already finished off the pleats by bringing the folded fabric all the way down to the bottom edge and pinning it in place, so it was just a matter of matching up all of the seams on the bodice with the seams on the skirt. Just make sure you have at least 1 seam allowance of extra material on your straight back edge of the skirt so that you have room to finish it later. I took it to the sewing machine and straight stitched all those layers in place. Honestly, the hardest part of this process was keeping track of all the pins because for some reason my giant cactus pin cushion is never where I need it. Then starting from the bottom edge, I sewed the center back straight seam together, stopping just a couple inches short of the top edge. But a couple inches from the top, I stopped so that I could sew the button backing and the elastic button loops to the top edge of the skirt. After fixing those closures in place, I moved on to hemming. I folded the fabric a 1/2 inch and then a full inch, and then just straight stitched all the way around. The very last thing to do to finish this nightgown was unfortunately hand sewing because we needed to fix the buttons in place. I'm using these lovely pearl shank style buttons, but sewing them in place is really straightforward and I won't bore you with the details of watching me very tediously sew 7 buttons. So I took one of those front panels. So I took one of those